briefly introduce what I've been working on that started with plants and gradually ended up being an investigation of our algorithmic cultures. And I'm very pleased to say that I think much of what Salvatore and Oriana have been talking about this morning, I'm also incorporating that in the practice and in the questioning. But yeah, I arrived to this from a slightly different path. So initially, about, 5, 6 years ago, I started asking myself how we live in this environment where we are surrounded by plants and very much dependent on their life for basically all the energy flows on Earth. And yet we are blind to them, right? This is because of a humanistic tradition of Western culture, which deems plants somehow primitive, right? Because they don't really express an individuality in the same way. They can clone themselves. Their bodies are structured in this sort of repetitive manner without a center, and also they don't move much. So it's very hard to think of what it's like to be a plant. And yet this was very provoking to me, and I set out to create this opus called Confronting Vegetal Otherness, which would investigate plant alterity and try to find common ground somehow. And for this, I would also tap into what I knew best from at that time, which was kind of a scientific understanding of the world, scientific methodology and all this knowledge that it brings. And so the idea was to come up with artworks as experiments to enact a different relationality between people and plants. And what is actually displayed here is a close-up of a performance called Scottopoesis. And you can see here, the performance actually took 20 hours. And I stood still as I could, while illuminated by a light from the backside. And during this process, the crest in front of me was sensing the light, but also sensing the shadow and reacting to it. So after 20 hours, we had proof that sort of intercognition happened. So questioning what it is that is there in the plants, I here insisted on being the human and demanding that the plants recognize me. Of course, even though this did mean that I had to commit to the stillness, it was still a bit of, an experiment of doubt, because it was only through this long duration and through the actual morphological change of the crest that we could see the difference, even though plants are actually extremely sensitive and would sense you just going over their bodies with a slight shadow. This was the first experiment. The next one was phytoteratology, where I took it from the level of the human to the level of the molecular and used hormones isolated from a urine to make basically plant-human monsters or plant babies. So these were conceived using biotechnology in artificial wombs, and I called them sort of phytopollutants because they're not genetically human, but they have been informed by this physical human presence and with the use of biotechnology. And this is why, to me, they sort of represent this monstrosity of a biological proximity. But what does this have to do with AI? Well, the apparatus used to create these monsters is very much related to it. Biotechnology operates in the realm of the digital as much as it does in the realm of the biological. All the schemas, all the knowledge, all the pathways, all the metabolomics are actually situated there as well. And Eugene Thacker calls this a biomediality. In the next performance called Strange Encounters, the micro-performance unfolded under a microscope. And it was actually about a meeting between two entities that are biotechnologically really relevant. On one hand, we had single-celled algae, and on the other, we had human cancer cells, the carcinoma of the bladder. And in this meeting, well, interesting things happened because we got the occurrence of a weird type of hybrid cell featuring an algae and a carcinoma cell combined together. But what was really important was that in this context, the human cells, or the humans, are already considered as material. They are the producers of knowledge, of antibodies. All the research that is done for vaccines or medicine is firstly performed in tissue cultures like this. And this type of materiality, the material excess of people is very much like a prepartus existence that we experience while we are absorbed by the digital. And I think you might get a sense of where I'm going. Let's start with the plants. Well, for us as people, we might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable being so intimately observed by technology. Plants have been there since ever, or not since ever, but definitely since the advent of agriculture and technology. They have been closely observed, manipulated, bettered, hybridized. So all of this efforts that now is also directed at us has gone into plant life in order to supply food for us. And so, as much as we are caught in the eye of the algorithm, so are the plants. And this is a picture of a vegetal index, normalized a differential vegetative index. It basically pictures taken by satellites that are able to discern where photosynthesis is taking place and on this large scale assess plant productivity. So while here we are discussing what our future would be like living in close proximity with intelligent robots, we might also want to look at how it's been for plants that actually have been tended to by all these robots for quite a while. So actually this brings me to a synthesis or the next step of my artistic research. Whereas before a lot of time I was dedicated to understanding plant alterity, plant otherness. I have come to realize that in certain contexts, we as people might have very much a lot in common with plants. And this is precisely through the gaze of the algorithm, because when algorithms look at us, they don't see us as people, as whole people, as individuals. Instead, they see us as whatever they're specifically looking for. So bits of data that is grouped into categories that then serve as proxies, so as stand-ins for some other action, behavior, moods, or quality that can later be manipulated. And so in this way, the way that AI, or just data collection, data processing, and algorithmic cultures approach people is very much a similar way that we have been approaching plants and considering plants as open, as manipulable, as organisms which can easily be discerned and mapped out. So basically we manipulate the environment, we have really nice produce that lasts long and it stays fresh or whatever. So this is a reality that we sort of slowly have to come to terms with. The humanistic human has kind of taken a step back and enters the statistical human. So with these next projects, actually, I'm still keeping plants close, but this time as allies, as sort of teachers, to see how we can cope with this new reality that we might not super be comfortable with. because of this intensification of the biopolitical that has been going on with the advancement of algorithmic technologies. Actually, on this surface layer, it seems that algorithms can do us a favor when it comes to acknowledging plants. And a lot of science communication is actually done this way. I don't know if you've recently encountered some articles like this, the tweeting spinach, or the emailing spinach, or the tweeting tree. So it's basically projects where the surveillance of plants, even though these plants might be actually modified, as is the spinach, which actually has some nanoparticles in its body to sense chemicals in the ground. Well, so they're modified, but connected to the internet in order to report in real time the environmental conditions. And this opens a little fantasy of ours. It brings us closer to this notion that we will be able to communicate with other organisms, especially plants, right? Because they are so foreign to us. And so it is within thinking about what this plant-human communication could be like if we were to pursue this. We developed this project, which is called Institute for Inconspicuous Languages, Reading Lips. So what you saw there were plant stomata, or leaf pores, which are actually holes in the leaves of plants, microscopic, through which the plants breathe and basically protect their inner bodies from the environment. So maybe sort of similar to mouths. And if you look at them in a longer time span and make a time-lapse movie, it's actually unavoidable almost that you see these mouths as, well, mouths. So as a way to approach this with a little bit of humor and also a sort of self-irony, we asked, first of all, an AI lip net, which has been trained on human lips, to try to discern what the plants are saying. And we sort of got a little bit of nonsense. And then we asked the human interpreter, Boen Mort, who actually works with the deaf and hard of hearing, to do the same. And so this effort went into trying to communicate with plants, but of course on insisting on language as the device through which communication should take place, the human, like the logos. Well, in fact, ironically, we are communicating with plants every time we are close to them, exchanging volatile compounds, every time we eat them, every time we probably talk to them. So it's sort of these two levels of functionality, but also, yeah, this is where we are. We have to really reconsider or consider actually how we are employing this AI and computation in general, to which ends are we asking the right questions? This is the lip reader installation as it was shown at Click Festival in Helsingør. The second work in this plant machine series is called Vegetariate Work Zero. So vegetariate is a term originally coined by Catriona Sanderland, and I think, well, for me it's been sort of a fundamental way to think about what it means to become this body laborer, consumer, producer of data in this particular society of, if you want to call it, surveillance capitalism. Because of my connection with plants and because of this thesis that, yeah, the vegetariat is populated by all living bodies that are caught in the gaze of the algorithm, it is easy for me to think and to substitute people with plants. So when I think about surveillance that we welcome into our lives, for example, smartwatches, I think about what is the position of other living bodies that exist in this urban landscape that might be actually performing similar tasks in our societies. And so I turn to these plants of Instagram, which are a particular brand of tropical plants that look very catchy and are easy to care for, usually don't require much watering, low light conditions. And I asked, what would it be if they were to enter this machine of biosurveillance as consumers? So what if instead of us, these plants were wearing smartwatches? And we used a simple hack, which is to put smartwatches, which are always connected to applications, on drill machines. And these drill machines were the strength of how, or the speed at which they turned, was actually corresponding to plant excitation. So we took a physiological signal from the plants and connected that to drill machines. So the smartwatches were counting steps, but these steps weren't really these steps weren't only obfuscations. They were actual activity of these plants, and this happens in real time. So it's a part of the plant that is actually reactive in the human timescale. So it's very uncanny to see these plants being active or being activated through their own principles. And this then is transmitted to the applications. So gradually, this big data, big other, is gathering information because it's indifferent to the quality of person that produced it. And is perhaps wondering, what is the desire of these new entities that have a very different activity profile than the people? So that was sort of the open question and the provocation of this work. Does it necessarily mean that these plants become consumers in order for their desires to also be accounted for? And this finally brings me, oops, sorry for the the pictures not being aligned. This brings me to the final work, the latest work called Play, and it's about the possibility for play between an AI controlled by an AI controlled robot and a cucumber plant. And so the starting point is that all living organisms play. It's a way of recognizing their bodies, their environment in this sort of non-utilitarian principle. And so we asked ourselves with a huge team of programmers and engineers, how can we write an AI and how can we design a robot that would have this potential to play with plants without necessarily making it into a game? How could the plant teach the AI gradually? And so we have a robot that is equipped with its particular sensorium with a LiDAR camera, so laser 3D. It creates sort of a 3D image of the plants. And also it has these tendrils, these wires, which it can raise and lower to get into the proximity of the plants. And as it scans the plants, as the plants are growing very slowly, so everything is happening in plant time, it creates sort of a mental picture, this latent space of the plant itself, which it then approaches also with plant speed. And the interaction between these two entities unfolds. So we actually it took us a long time to try to write this algorithm which would accommodate the slowness of plants, so not a lot of data at all, or as we heard, data by datum by datum. as well as how to write something that is non-utilitarian, that actually invites an excess of living bodies rather than reducing them, right? So we did this by making the algorithm really simple and allowing the plant to grow it by whenever it touches the tendrils. This feeds back into this simple neural network, which, as the cucumbers develop, so does the neural network. So they both kind of grow, and they are both, the morphology of both cucumbers and AI is shaped by each other. So thank you very much.
Okay.